Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and hope you've all had a great spring break. Our first lecture after the spring break is to be given in honor of Harry Potter. And for those of you who have been here for a very short period of time, Harry Potter was a legendary dean of School of Architecture, joining UVA School of Architecture in 1969 and retiring in, I think, 1995. It's 26 years of service in UVA. He became dean in 1989. He founded the school, the Department of Landscape Architecture, and was appointed the first architect of the university. He was a great advocate of environmental ethic, the importance of the public realm, environmental stewardship, and preservation of cultural landscapes. And his influence remains in our school through his most talented students, as you all know, Beth Maya, Ruben Rainey, and Nancy Takahashi. Among many other centers, we now have a Center for Cultural Landscape, which is in part due to his legacy. And that's now headed by Beth Maya and Jessica Sua. So one of the most important legacy in this emphasis on interdisciplinarity is that the Porter Chair is actually rotating between the four departments, and we are absolutely honored to be able to host this year's Porter lecture from the Department of Architectural History. We are, of course, in competition with the pumpkin ash tree, which is planted outside Pavilion 9, which is used to be the residence of the dean of School of Architecture, where Porter lived for 4 years. Now we've shifted to Pavilion 6, which is equally good, I'm sure. John Castine, was the former university president, stated that Harry was a dean who did things elegantly, gently, modestly, and above all, brilliantly. The impression that one always has comes to mind: Harry, thoughtful, cool, sympathetic, principled, and gentle, quietly teaching culture and value, often about planning and landscape architecture, but always about life and how we should live it well. And it is with that memory that I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Annabel Wharton. Annabel Wharton is William B. Hamilton Professor of Art History in Duke University and Vincent Scully visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture in 2014. She received her Ph.D. at the Courtauld Institute, London University. Initially, her research focused on late ancient and Byzantine art and culture, and then she began to investigate the effects of modernity on ancient landscapes, notably in building the Cold War, Hilton International hotels, and modern architecture. She has combined her interest in the ancient and the modern in her last 2 books, Selling Jerusalem, Relics, Replicas, Theme Parks, and what comes to our attention very recently is this brilliant book called Architectural Agents, The Delusional, Abusive, Addictive Lives of Buildings, published by Minnesota University Press in 2015. Architectural Agents considers consider material and digital buildings as agents that both endure pain and inflict it. And she has begun work on a new project treating the theory and practice of models, conceptual and material, analog and digital, and tentatively entitled Manipulating Models. And it is with great pleasure that I give the podium to Annabel, and she'll tell you all about it.
Can everybody hear me okay? Let me know if I stray from the microphone. I want to thank everybody who was involved in my being brought to UVA this semester. I've enjoyed myself immensely. I've enjoyed my students immensely. And I'm glad to be here this evening. I'm currently working, as you've heard, on models. And let's see, where am I? I mean all models. I'm interested in economic pie charts, Barbie dolls, video games, and models, of course, are everywhere. As climate change models demonstrate with particular force, models are involved in our daily lives, and they have a great effect on the future of our own selves, but also our planet. The power and ubiquity of models makes them really a crucial object of study. And models have long been discussed and very seriously considered by physical and social scientists who appreciate their contribution to research and who have spent a great deal of time looking at the theory and practice of models generally. Quantitative scientists have recognized models as autonomous agents and have dealt with model theory and data, which are now essential to a fuller knowledge of the world. I mean, models are really now what make up science. Humanities have only more recently become interested in model theory, and we humanists, I think, have something to add even to scientists' notions of how models work. So this evening, I want to begin to make an argument that all models are historical, which is a position that is resisted by economists, for instance, and that all models are political, which is a position resisted by physicists, I found. And finally, that all models are entangled deeply in discourse. So these are three elements that have not been as fully acknowledged by the sciences as they possibly should be, and I want to make a proposal that those elements are essential to understanding how models work. And this point is easily made in architecture, to which I will return later at the very end of the talk, but I want to concentrate this evening on a particular scientific model, the medical body model, that is the cadaver, because it offers, as do economists and physicists, really quite interesting and generative resistance to my argument. So a model must have a referent from which it is distinct. A model isn't a model without a referent. With the body model, the model and its human referent do not appear to be systemically different. The body model also appears ahistorical. That is, a cadaver from 3rd century BCE Alexandria doesn't seem so different than the body in the UVA gross anatomy lab now. You know, have bodies really changed? So this first problem, the distinction between the body model and its human referent, is relatively easily resolved. The term model is now commonly applied to bodies that work for artists, clothing designers, and Miss Universe contest organizers. Although the body of such a model belongs to a particular human, in its function as model, the body is idealized, abstracted, and commoditized. The life of its possessor, though often discussed in popular media, hardly matters. Her intellect is not of interest. All that concerns and all that counts is her appearance. The model is presented as the paradigmatic way humans in general should look. Now, the cadaver, now in the gross anatomy lab, functions in much the same way as the fashion model. Her life and intellect are not of a concern. She also claims to be paradigmatic of the way the human in general should look, though that semblance lies primarily within the body rather than on its surface. She too is idealized and abstracted. She is distinct from the fashion model in that she resists commoditization. Both the cadaver and the supermodel differ from their reference, ordinary human beings whose bodies need to be accessorized or healed. A supermodel is distinct from her reference, not only in her social context, her age, and her occupation, but most crucially in her proportions and her flawlessness. Everything she wears looks good on her. The same cannot be said of all her reference in her audience. In contrast, the best body model for medical schools is that which differs as little as possible from her human reference. But just as fashion models, who generally act vertically, must have a certain height and a certain weight, so cadavers, who generally act horizontally, now must conform to length and weight restrictions in order to be accepted into the major body donation programs that exist. At least in the United States, bodies used for medical training are thereby increasingly distinguished from those of the general population because the obese are unacceptable. But that body model differs from her referent even more dramatically than the fashion model does from hers. The body model is a dead human and her referents are live ones. So models are both weak and strong, and that relative strength or weakness depends on their relationship with their referent. And I think the same thing can be said of architecture as of bodies here, and in most things I'm claiming about models. A weak model relates to its referent like a copy. Copies are always weaker than their models. It is apparently derivative and subordinate, like Constantine Boehm's model of the Pentagon. A strong model activates its referent, like Raphael Vignoli's model of the Nasher Museum. But one of the models, of all models, really remarkable characteristics is its potential to oscillate between the two, between being strong and being weak. And just as an example of that, I brought the Barbie doll. The Barbie doll, for example, is a weak model of a supermodel. It's copied from a supermodel, but might cause a young possessor to develop later in her maturity an eating disorder. The medical body model, like the Barbie, oscillates between strength and weakness. She may be weak in relationship to the ideal body, but as a medical student's first patient or the medical student's silent teacher, she provides her users with the model for their future subjects, their future patients. That medical body model is similar to other body models, but different from her reference, is easily established, I think. Identifying the ways in which a 21st century cadaver is distinct from its earlier instantiations takes a little bit more historical work. My claim is that the body model is by no means stable. As society and technology change, so does the body model. Changes recorded in the physical properties of the cadaver. That is, I'll argue that the cadaver in 3rd century BCE Alexandria is really truly different than the body that's in the medical laboratory now. But even more dramatically, cultural shifts are revealed not just in the body of the cadaver, but in its representations. You can see it more clearly in its representations. So how the body model is seen, after all, is described by how it is depicted. So we can get a better sense of what the body model was seen to be by its representations. So here I present for consideration 3 examples: a pre-modern example, an early modern example, and a contemporary Anthropocene model of both bodies. I'll talk about the bodies that they represent and the representations. So my first example is medieval example. It's from this really wonderful manuscript. It's in the Bodleian Library. It's manuscript number 399. It was produced around 1292. It's a late 13th century manuscript. It's a medical miscellany. It has all kinds of different bits and pieces of medical information in it, and it's full of representations of the medical body model. Its first full-page illumination, that is right at the beginning of the text, is this one. And it's a diagram of the reproductive system of the dissected human female. In the fundus of the uterus is the infant, a small, naked, but sexless human in an oval. The text framing the body identifies the subject. And here is a translation of the Latin. Here the created seed has its place. Here the infant is nourished and grows. Here falls the semen when it is fallen and is collected from the testicles. And in the Middle Ages, ovaries were referred to as testicles generally. And then deposited. So attached to the side of the uterus are the ovaries. You can see them quite clearly. Oops. Those are the ovaries. At the base of the uterus is the vaginal channel. The red borders are identified as ligaments. The teardrop shapes and the gray strips are tagged as muscles. Almost all the elements on the left are marked same here, so it's a mirror image of the features on the right. A comparison with the Netter image, which are, the Netter images were produced in the 1950s, but they're still really popular in medical schools. And I think this also shows the same thing, the female uterus, and you can see that there's a certain similarity, that it is recognizable as this object that's being represented. Like its modern counterpart, the identification of its features depends on labels, so this is deeply embedded in texts. The Ashmole representation is nevertheless really unmistakably medieval. I mean, we can recognize it as a uterus, but it is really a medieval uterus. It is a diagram of its object rather than its image. There's no mimetic interest at all in this form. Its form is fully high Gothic, symmetrical but not quite, curvilinear and calligraphic but very controlled. Its unmechanical hand-drawn structures are really quite elegantly architectural. The folio has the sensibility of the tracery of a contemporary church window. The image is also embedded in texts. The diagram has been invaded by them in the 14th century. That is, the texts that surround most of this image, apart from the labels, were not original to the miniature, but were later additions. The original emptiness of the page must have contributed to the clarity of the original model, but its spareness invited later scribes to fill it up. So it was a kind of horror vacui, fill it up with texts. And those texts are recipes for improving women's health. I think the one that's been scrubbed out might well have been a recipe for abortion. You can notice that here there's a race text, which must have been thought to be dangerous in some ways. But so these texts don't relate directly to the image. It doesn't help you explain the image, but it certainly does relate to how the image performs, what it's meant to do. So this illumination is not only enfolded in complementary text, but it's accompanied in the manuscript by a large number of other really remarkable images of the human. Uteruses with fetuses in different positions, a wonderful diagram of male genitalia, 5 full-page illustrations of the body's systems, including arteries, veins, bones, etc., and really a quite wonderful diagram of the brain, which is the one that's down here on the left. You can see the little nose at the bottom of the page. So there was also, in 8 panels on 4 separate pages, a very lively narrative of a relationship between a female patient and her doctor. This relationship, unfortunately, ends badly with her dissection. And that page is, I have a full page of that, so you can see it. So you have this manuscript that begins with this uterus and then has within it this narrative depiction of how that understanding might have come to be. So this representation, I think, shows a familiarity with anatomization. The organs are enlarged and recognizably rendered and carefully arranged on the picture plane for the viewer's inspection. If the image suggests the dissection was known, it also implies that it was not quite socially acceptable. The dissection occurs not in a building, but in a landscape. As in contemporary representations of Jesus' tormentors in the Passion, the anatomist is grotesque. He appears alarmed at being caught in the act by the doctor. All of this is evidence that the procedure was at the time illicit, unlike was embalming or autopsy. But although dissections are not textually attested in England or northern France, from which this manuscript comes, it's either English or northern French, this image certainly suggests that they were carried out, whether licitly or illicitly, probably clandestinely. In this narrative image, the medical body model is an aristocratic woman, unknown to us, but obviously familiar to those in her story. There are a variety of other contemporary references to medieval medical body models. At one extreme, the heretic and criminal, whose name was Christianus, but he was obviously a heretic, was publicly vivisected by medical practitioners in Constantinople. Theophanes, a chronicler of the 9th century, describes the occasion, which I quote to you. Christianus, an apostate from the Christian faith and a leader of armed brigands, was captured. They cut off his hands and feet on the Mole of St. Thomas, which is a hill in Constantinople, brought in physicians and dissected him from his pubic region to his chest while he was still alive. This they did with a view to understanding the structure of man. In this condition, they gave him over to the flames. So that's one kind of extreme example of the medieval familiarity with dissection. At the other extreme is the anatomizing of the saintly nun, Chiara, a late 14th century figure, whose viscera revealed symbols of the Passion and whose anatomized heart performed miracles. So these examples suggest that the Western medieval medical body model might have been abject, like that of Christianus, or holy, like that of the beatified Chiara, but that despised or beloved, it was certainly known and often very familiar. So how does the Bodleian image relate to its medical body model, the cadaver? I would say it relates indexically or diagrammatically. The image points to its complex referent by reducing it to a system, in the same way that an index makes the contents of a book clear and accessible. This abstract instantiation of the body model was not, as moderns have all too often assumed, a matter of artists' or patrons' remoteness from the body. It wasn't that they didn't know what a body looked like. A distance that has been assumed by moderns which was imposed by superstition, fear of contamination, and ignorance, none of which are really as true as moderns would like to think they are. People in the Middle Ages were much more familiar than we are with guts, mainly animal, but also human. The tortured and the wounded, heretics and saints, all revealed the workings of the body. What was sought was a conceptual clarity of that body's truth. So that's the end of the medieval example. I want to turn now to an early modern example. This is a familiar example. Probably many of you will know it. My second example is Andrea Vesalius's, comes from his book, The Fabric of the Human Body. It was produced in Italy 250 years after Ashmole 399. It also includes extraordinary images of both the narrative dissection of a woman and a rendering of the female reproductive system. So it makes a nice parallel to the medieval example. The difference between the representations in the two works document the remarkable shifts that occurred not only in early modern European society, technology, and art, but also in the ontology or the nature of the medical body model. The frontispiece of Vesalius's book, which we've been looking at, is a virtuoso woodcut which has attracted intense scholarly attention. And itself represents attention. The architecture stages an enclosed elite space in which members of an all-male audience struggle to see the naked woman at the center. The carnivalesque character of the depiction is marked in the grotesques which inhabit it and in the laughing skeleton, which looks away from the woman but designates her attention to her with his staff. The table on which the body lies is tipped upwards so that the reader has the best possible view of the vulnerable body. That body has been opened by the author, who looks at us at the same time that he, like the skeleton, shows his attention to the body through his gesture. The monkey and the dog in the lower corners of the print await their turn for dissection. And they also suggest that the female object of the image is not fully human. And indeed, like the dog and the monkey, the woman is not a member of the same human community as her audience. She was an alien and she was a criminal. Vesalius does not name her, but he describes her physically and socially. She had an exceptionally large stature. She had given birth many times. She was a woman condemned to death who had attempted to delay her execution by claiming that she was pregnant. Law codes in 16th century Italy further suggest that she was not native of the city in which she was executed and dissected. The only bodies legally provided to anatomists were those of criminals that were alien criminals. Medical body models could not be members of the body politic. They had to be foreigners, residing at least 35 miles beyond the borders of the state in which they were executed. So these were anonymous, truly anonymous figures. The medical body model in 16th century Italy and into the 20th century in Europe and North America was the abject body. Whether it was the legally acquired corpse of a criminal or the illicit stolen cadaver of the socially marginal. In the text, Vesalius recounts such a theft with remarkable callousness. So this is from the text of which this is the frontispiece, and I'm quoting. "The students of Padua snatched from her grave and brought in for public dissection the elegant mistress of a monk at the Church of St. Anthony here. She had apparently died from a stroke. With astonishing industry, they had removed all the skin from the cadaver, so she would not be recognized by the monk who, with the prostitute's parents, was complaining to the urban prefect that the body had been stolen." So it's like that's right in the text. It's not hidden. And not only is there this remarkably callous text, but there's also an insouciant image of the same thing in the text. Here we have as an initial, an illustrated initial, the stealing of a body at night by a set of putti. The flame signifies that it's at night, and probably, no doubt, illicit as well. So despite the exaggerated emphasis on the female body in the narrative frontispiece that we've just been looking at, the text itself introduces systematically only the male body. The dissection deals almost exclusively with the male body, beginning with the skeleton and the muscles and the gut, culminating in the dissected head. Its lavish full-page illustrations of the male body in various stages of dissection are famous for their verisimilitude and for the classical tropes that they reenact. The depiction of the female anatomy is limited to partial page images and figures of her reproductive system. The rendering exposes a carefully described veristic anatomy within an idealized marble encasement of a fragmentary classical sculpture. The abject body of the criminal alien or socially marginal is masked by the visual rhetoric of the elite object. The relation of Vesalius's rendering to its body model is iconic. Its representation may be characterized as that of idealized mimeticism. So my final contemporary cadaver demonstrates again the changed ontology of the medical body model in the Anthropocene present. Photographs are not allowed in the anatomy lab, so I got this off the internet just as kind of wallpaper as I talk about it. So the cadaver that I want to talk about is not one that you're looking at, obviously, but is one of 40 in the anatomy lab in the basement of Duke Hospital. She was the object of study of 5 first-year medical students and myself. She was to us anonymous. Teams often name their cadavers in order to avoid calling the cadaver it. We named our cadaver Lucy. And shortly after her death, Lucy was embalmed and refrigerated. Although she is as complex and idiosyncratic as her patient reference, she's lost most of her color and a lot of her viscosity. She was, however, heart-renderingly humanly present in the anatomy lab, but she was by no means fresh. That distinguishes her from the body models of the past, which were fresh. It also made her much less dangerous to her observers than were the toxic bodies of the recently dead that were used up through the 19th century into the 20th century for medical purposes. The materiality of the body model then is deeply modified. It's the cadaver that we looked at Duke Medical School is very different than the anatomical object of the doctors in 3rd century BCE Alexandria. Further, in contrast to the body models of the past who were either known or not known, Lucy was both. Beyond her age and cause of death, Lucy was to us anonymous. At the same time, she was well known by the administrators of the body donation program at Duke, who kept very careful track of her. The body kept its personal history and indeed it added to it. That is, Lucy had a really important post-mortem work to do. Like the anatomized saints in the Middle Ages, Lucy very much retained her aura. She was and remains an integral part of her community, beloved and honored. The donated body, at every stage of its contribution, is very carefully treated. We were mentored on how we should behave and what the appropriate behavior towards her was. After she made her final contribution to science, her dissected remains were cremated, then returned to her family or distributed in Duke Forest. Memorial services have been held in her honor, in which those of us who she educated expressed our gratitude. The contemporary medical body model, at least in Europe and in North America, may be understood then not as in the Middle Ages as the beloved subject, but as the beloved object, and not as in early modernity as the abject object, but rather as the cherished object. What explains the shift in the ontology of the medical body model from abject to beloved and from subject to object? Most obviously, the source of the body model and the cultural system within which it moved. Episodically, from antiquity through modernity, the criminal, the heretic, the alien body has been licitly provided by authorities to medical practitioners. More perniciously pervasive was the stolen body. The body, let's see what we have here. Body theft was conventionally limited to the socially marginal, like Vesalius's mistress. But by the 19th century, the demand for cadavers was so pressing that the bodies of the middle class came under threat, and the need for cadavers finally infringed on the sensibilities of those with social standing. Riots, for instance, resulted in 1842 after the theft of a 19-year-old daughter of a substantial farmer from her grave in West Haven, Connecticut. Local militia had to protect Yale College of Medicine from being burned down by an angry crowd. UVA Medical School avoided this problem by ravaging the graveyards almost exclusively of African Americans. And the doctors here, the medical students here, were responsible for finding their own cadavers for many years. So such conditions contributed to the legalization of the use of unclaimed bodies for anatomizing, both in England and the United States. The Anatomy Act passed in Parliament in 1832, and like that of a criminal, the body of the pauper was outside, or regarded as outside, modern society as she had never been in the Middle Ages. Her body was found to be as much of a burden to society in death as it had been in life. The medical profession, and here I have this quite nice illustration by Pugin to remind you of the architectural setting of such things. So, like that of the criminal, the body of the pauper was outside of modern society, as I've said. The medical profession relieved the community of its funerary obligations to noxious things. The threat of dissection, which had been used as a deterrent for murder in the past, was now deployed as a deterrent for destitution. The system didn't last very long. Shifts in the Protestantized societies of Europe and North America caused the loss of unclaimed bodies to anatomy labs in those regions. With the broad social reforms of the later 19th and early 20th century, the child labor laws, universal education, voting enfranchisement, and the like, the appropriation of the poor body for anatomization came under increasingly incensed moral scrutiny. The secularization of society also brought about the secularization of the body. Protestants gave up harvesting relics from their famous preachers like George Whitefield. Locks of hair were no longer given to relatives and friends on the deathbed. Cremation, which was against the law in many countries in the West, became a cause of reformers in the 1870s. It was legalized in England and many states in the US in the early 20th century. It's worth noting that the Catholic Church opposed cremation until 1963, and cremation is still abhorred by Orthodox Jews. Israel did not have a crematorium until 2003, and ultra-Orthodox Jews burnt it down in 2007. Nevertheless, the popularization of cremation as an appropriate way of treating the beloved body is symptomatic of modernity's secular adaptation of economic and technological change. The acceptance of cremation corresponds to the slower but just as sure public embrace of the donation of the body for the benefit of medical science. As an early example of body donation is offered, of course, by the famous Jeremy Bentham, the wonderful utilitarian philosopher who's had such an effect on our lives in so many ways. He's an old friend of mine because I actually had my first baby in University College Hospital, and he founded University College and hangs out there in the lobby. So, I got to know him quite well and met him again in New York when he was on display at a exhibition at the Met Breuer this summer. Anyway, he's an interesting guy, gets around. Bentham had worked for the institution of the British Anatomy Act surreptitiously. He arranged for his body to be dissected immediately after his death, but then he kept control of his body, in contrast to most medical body models, and had it embalmed after it was dissected, and that's why he lurks around even today. So the donated body, it's so well exemplified by Bentham, has become the privileged body and the preserved body. Bentham exerted control over his body, like I said, after he was dead, carefully embalmed and housed in the college so he could go to the board meetings annually. But like Bentham, I should say in contrast to Bentham, Lucy was embalmed before her dissection and not after, and she hasn't stayed around. But like Bentham, she remained a cherished object through the entire sequence of her use. So the change in the representation of the basic medical body model has really dramatically changed. It's very different now than in the past, at least in many countries, not all. But the change in the representation of the medical body in the Anthropocene is in some ways even more dramatic than that of its ontology. The dominant contemporary image of the medical body is a hyper-real rendering. There are many technologies by which such representations are produced, from MRI scans of sliced cadavers to plastinated bodies. And there are the examples of Gunther von Hagen's body worlds, which are notorious, with questions about where these bodies were gotten and so on. But all of these images of the medical body model share certain features of their production, consumption, and commodification. One of those modes of representation is the Ackland. I'll just let this run as I talk. One of those modes of representation, very common now, is the Ackland Video Atlas of the Human Anatomy, which we used in our lab at Duke. Here, the digitalized dissection is presented as compellingly three-dimensional on our flat screens. In it, the female reproductive system is initially isolated, then rendered in place in a cadaver that is much fresher than Lucy. Ackland's videos deploy a combination of old photographic and dissection techniques with new digital media to make the human interior absolutely present to its audience. Though perhaps not as cutting edge as the Visible Human project, it perfectly describes our current culture's representational desires. I think we've seen enough. The indexical diagram of the Middle Ages and the mimetic icon of early modernity and modernity have been replaced now by the hyper-real ectypic image, the simulacrum. Well, the question, of course, becomes whether the simulacrum will, as is its wont, replace the physical body model. Will Lucy be replaced by her representations in future anatomy labs? In many of those places where the expense of body donation programs or regional cultural practices make it difficult to attain cadavers, they already have. Elaborate synthetic bodies and animated mannequins programmed with various physical disabilities have been patented. These objects have, however, so far proven very weak models of the human body. Computational representations do not yet provide as full an experience of the human body as the human body, its complex layering, its peculiar anomalies, and its resistance to probing. Lucy was scanned in preparation for her dissection, but my team consistently considered the body before it consulted the scan. The scan was always a weak copy of the body. Like attempts to move the human onto the computational platform, make us all robots, but robots that could live forever, efforts to replace cadavers with digital proxies have so far failed. A corpse is expensive to acquire and to maintain. Institutions make large capital investments in body donation programs, cadaver preservation, and dissection facilities. Students endure formaldehyde and refrigeration. Nevertheless, despite their costs and liabilities, science, it still seems, needs bodies. So in conclusion, I think that the anatomical cadaver does the work of nuancing as well as reinforcing our understanding of models in general. The body model is an autonomous agent affecting sometimes deeply, as it did in my case, the humans who encounter it. The cadaver is a weak model, the passive derivative of the living body, but is also the strong model directly affecting its many referents, namely the damaged living bodies for which it provides the prototype. The body model is deeply embedded in discourse. The texts and diagrams that explain it, the images and interpretations that it informs, the articles and presentations like this one that it has generated. And its politics are a politics of culture. Finally, the historical character of the body model is most clearly revealed in its representations. The pre-modern indexical diagram, the early modern and modern mimetic image or analog, and the Anthropocene digital ectype or simulacrum. These same terms, I think, and this is what I initially planned to do in the lecture, is apply these terms that are discoverable in a scientific model to architecture. I don't think I have time to do that as thoroughly as I would like to do, but I would like to at least gesture in that direction. And I use as an example here my favorite example, building that I know well, which are models made of Christianity's most sacred site, the Holy Sepulchre. The pre-modern indexical diagram is not unlike the diagram that we saw of the human body in Bodleian 399. the early modern mimetic image or analog, the attempt to render realistically the church and its space, and finally then the simulacrum of modernity. There are lots of them that I could have chosen, from images of the Holy Sepulchre in Assassin's Creed to this one. This is from the Holy Land theme park in Orlando, in which the Holy Sepulchre is narrated and revived with living images of the crucified Jesus. So, what does this suggest generally about models? What changes in models form reveal that changes in model forms reveal, I think, very clearly fundamental shifts in cognitive practice. That is, difference in model making is not just a matter of changes in technology, the technology of building or making. It's not just digitalization that have changed models, but rather that those changes reflect significant differences in cognitive practice. Differences in model making reveal differences, in other words, in world thinking, and that the study of models is also the investigation of the hermeneutics of history. Thank you. So this is very much work in progress, so I'd love to have any comments or corrections or reflections or experiences with bodies.
Since you referenced the digital replication, is this on? No. But, all right, so with the digital representation of these historical models,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a comparison of how...
It's still not on. Do you want to come up here? And,
No, I
yeah.
can just yell.
Okay. Can everybody hear? Yeah.
Compare the Assassin's Creed models, or however that is represented in modern times for the modern experience, where you actually get to choose to see your perspective. The work in progress, the addition of that would be a great comparison.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love Assassin's Creed, so, it was hard for me to not put that in, but, and display my knife throwing abilities as part of the scene. But yeah, I think digitalization, as you all know from your experience in architecture, not only has offered us new affordances, but also represents certain dangers, because for most of us, certainly for me, my understanding of how the algorithms work in the various black boxes that surround me in my normal life, like my car and my computer and even my toothbrush these days, are uncontrollable by me. And I think digitalization is the one technology that's been developed that might get out of control in terms of producing models that are no longer under our control. I mean, some things are happening in that direction with for instance, climate change models. But I certainly will do that with... What I want to work on is a comparison, a more detailed comparison between developments in architecture and in other scientific models. And that would be the production of realistic spaces, whether they're on an architectural screen or in a video game or whatever. It's really very powerful development.
Annabel, thank you so much for the lecture. and sharing kind of your ongoing research with us. I'm curious about your starting point. Like when I think back to the first image that you showed of the many models, you know, from science, architecture, et cetera, that you decided to start first with a human model, which of course in a school of architecture we use the term models all the time, and I'm sure that nobody, when they think about models, thinks about cadavers or living models, right?
Yeah.
That they're both the living model as the human model and the kind of dead model of the cadaver, that becomes a starting point as opposed to scientific models, artistic models, et cetera, which in some ways have to do with abstracting or diagramming spatially a kind of concept, which is very, very different, right, than how a cadaver is used. So I'm curious about how that became your starting point.
Well, it's not. I mean, it's really, I've been working on models for now about 6-7 years, and the cadaver is a real late comer, but it's the one that I just got out of the anatomy lab, so I have to talk about it. So it's gained a prominence now just because of that circumstance. The experience of dissecting a body was for me just like an existential other world. And the topography, doctors talk about bodies very much like architects talk about structures. I mean, there are lots of similarities which I could have played out, and I will play out more. How you identify the location of particular things in a body, it's all done through directions. So the topography of the body has a lot to do, has a lot in common with models of landscapes and so on. But so there are similarities, but I came to it really quite late, and you know, all of our research is always autobiographical. And my beloved partner died and gave his body to medicine in the process of my working on this book. And so part of this interest in cadavers is finding out how he spent his last, you know, labor. So, but once I got into it, I don't think it's entirely arbitrary to see it as an important model to look at critically. Certainly it is different than your typical like economic pie chart or something, but it's also it's been at the heart of scientific study of the body forever, you know, for at least in Western history. And it's also one of the few, it's a particular interest to me because it's one of the few models that resist digitalization. And my suspicions of digitalization make it an attractive subject for that reason. So it's a long answer to your question.
So I had a question that's related in part to this Western historical frame, right? Because the story you've told is very convincing and very interesting. But when I think about models, I lived in China for some years, and in the presence of the hyper-realistic architectural model, so that every time when you go to a new building or to a new town, there's this quite elaborate hyper-realistic model. In Shanghai, the Urban Planning Museum has a whole floor, huge floor of a museum that is all a model of Shanghai that is constantly being updated as the city itself is updated. So I'm curious about how, because it's not a digital model, it's a physical model.
Yeah.
And it's clearly extremely important in that context, right? The model plays a different architectural and social, the architectural model plays a different social role in that context. So this may be outside your range, but when you think about architectural models, we're often dealing with a global practice.
Yeah. No,
That's a curious point.
it's an interesting question. I've never been to China, and my pulmonologist, because I have bronchitis, says that I cannot go. I was supposed to go teach in Kunshan, and I'm very sorry to not have been able to do that. But so my knowledge is really limited to the West. But there are, I mean, China is still building panoramas, like that 19th century phenomenon in the United States. They're still interested in all these visual technologies that the West has worked through. So I can't help but think that there's a parallel, for instance, to the great model of New York City out in the Queens Museum, which up until 9/11 was kept in date too. You know, so it was always updated. And how these things function depends on who's looking at them. But they're all political. I mean, they all have a politics, whether it's a macro politics of trying to get your highways through the city, or whatever. But or in Singapore, the models are used to kind of promote the notion of the global city. They all have a politics, and that's a wonderful subject. These historical city models, whether they're the abjectly political ones that Mussolini and Hitler made, or whether they're the ones that seem a little tamer, that are produced in New York or Shanghai or wherever.
Thanks for your lecture. Weak and strong model is defined by their relationship with reference, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question is, why study the relationship between the model and its reference? What can it tell us?
What can that?
Can it tell us?
I mean, the wonderful thing about this vacillation of weak and strong is that it allows the model to both reflect its referent, but also to reflect on its referent. That is, it makes you rethink the referent. And I think that's the importance of that oscillation, that ability that models always have the potential to make you question your assumptions about the archetype. And I think that's one of the essential, really interesting things about models and how they work.
Annabel, thank you so much for this really stimulating lecture. I'm wondering about the distinction between the temporal relationship between the model and the referent. Most of your examples here, the model post-dates the referent, in the sense that it reflects back on something, or reflects something that is continuous. The way schools of architecture often think about models is that the model precedes the thing to be built.
Yeah, like the Vignoli image.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's very clear to us that the model that refers to something that already exists is clearly a political product. What I'm interested in is, are there ways for us to, or how should we imagine what's often characterized as the neutral modeling of a thing that doesn't yet exist as a political construct?
Yeah, well, I think my reaction would be that especially in architecture schools, it's more micropolitical than macropolitical. That is, the way a model works, or at least as I've experienced it in critiques, first of all, the model never works the way the author thinks it should. You know, like the student is always disappointed in how the model does not work for his critics. But the politics, or the micropolitics of getting things selected for production, for instance, or because that's how models very often work. They're a way of developing ideas, but they're also a way of selling those ideas. whether it's to your critics in a studio critique or whether it's to your to possible patrons in an architectural firm. So I don't know. I'm sure there's a much more interesting answer to that.
I wonder just a little bit, as a follow-up to that, I wonder a little bit about the embedded nature of implicit bias.
Mm-hmm.
We think of digitalization as itself inherently neutral.
Yeah, no, it's not. No, yeah.
So in what ways does implicit bias play a role in the projective modeling process?
Yeah.
And you don't have to answer that question. I think that's where I might go.
Yeah.
Your follow-up question.
Yeah. No, I think, but anything we make is biased. I mean, the making of things is an expression of bias, whether personal or cultural or whatever.
I think that's right. The digital technology falsely presumes for us the notion that it is culture-free, therefore
Yeah.
politics-free.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Oh, so we're talking about the models now. I was thinking, I'm so old-fashioned. I was thinking of these really nice wooden models that students use. I wasn't thinking of the screen at all.
Well, I think the same is true for both.
Yeah, yeah. But it's a much greater problem with the digital because it's so naturalized. It's not a matter of the fact that they're biased. They're so naturalized that people think they're producing something that's theirs, and it's not. It's an algorithmic construction. And our landscape is being polluted by these things all the time now. So it's really dangerous.
Hi. I was wondering, I was really interested in this idea of the connection between the model and the text, and you had traced that a little bit through the pre-modern, the medieval drawing of the ovaries, and how it's literally embedded with the text. And I noticed in the example from the 50s that it has this sort of like taxonomic relation of the text to the image. I'm curious how you what you think about the relationship between the text and the model in the Anthropocene, whether it's something that still has relevance, whether it's sort of subsumed by the hyperreal object, or if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, nice question. The balance has changed. Certainly in medical practice, through the Middle Ages, really into early modernity, the text was dominant. I mean, the text would be read and then the body would be looked at. And that still actually happens in medical school. I mean, we went to like 3 hours of lectures before we went to work on the dissection. But the text remains, even if the balance is shifted, that there's more concern with the hyperreality, the visual as a main source of information. Those images are always surrounded, if not by written text, by audio ones. That you are continuously fed what you should be thinking in looking at them. So there's and rather than text, maybe discourse in the Foucauldian sense would be a better way of thinking about this relationship. But I can't think of a model that is independent of discourse. So a balance has shifted maybe, but it's still there.
Hi, thank you again. I think something that's really interesting that's emerging in this parallel for me between the cadaver and architecture is this idea, because you talked about how architects talk about models. I think we kind of talk about them maybe in two ways. One is a more living model, a kind of assembly, which is the opposite of what's happening with the disassembly of the corpse.
Yeah.
But then we have these other models like Shanghai was mentioned, and these sort of post-production kind of dead models that come about that are very clearly to us political models that come about. And it seems to me that you're not only making an argument maybe for a particular kind of study of anatomy, but a particular kind of model and a particular kind of architectural process of making. So I wonder where this is going in terms of architectural process and arguments about how we should proceed in creating models and thinking about how
Yeah.
we make things.
Yeah, the project really is a project of establishing a community of models. Models have been seen as these profligate things that nobody knows what it means to call something a model, and I'm looking to develop a definition that includes all models. And once you see the community of models, then the next step is to suggest that characteristics which are most obvious in some models are actually found in all models. So that by looking at certain aspects of the cadaver, you're going to find things that you wouldn't expect to find in architectural models, but they are there. So it's that kind of community that I'm interested really in probing. The architecture thing, it really, for me, the big problem now is the black box of the programs that are used in construction and what their limitations are. I'm always aware of their limitations because I'm not good enough at any of them to work them in such a way that they're natural to me. Like I still fight with SketchUp. It's like I'm really hard pressed to be convincing. So I know what the limitations are of programs. But those people who really are familiar with them and think that they are doing what they want them to do, those are the people who are in danger. And it's that kind of aspect that I think thinking about digital things going on in other places, not so much with the corpse, but with, for instance, climate change modeling or other scientific models, where people no longer talk of the black box as a metaphor, but it's a real thing. Scientists don't know what's going on in the process. They're beyond control. And that's the kind of thing that I think architects should really be wary of when they use their programs.
Hi. This is slightly following on for a conversation we had last night about medieval models and copies, because I'm really struck by the anatomy diagram, which we talked about, and then this one with this idea of this abstracted kind of critical knowledge that gets conveyed in medieval diagramming as a way of then being able to copy what you think is important about it. And looking at this lineup of images is kind of more a comment. I was just really struck by now we often make models that are intended to be experiential, but always creating this very particular kind of experience that we're led to believe is neutral, when in fact it's not. And I was looking at this, thinking about this whole idea that in the Middle Ages, the copy has an experience with it, and we were talking about how the sense is that you're at the Holy Sepulchre, even if you're in Cambridge, England, or wherever you happen to be. And to a certain extent with this, but also with things like Assassin, it's this idea that you're recreating in the same kind of way an experience, even though it looks, much more like a simulacrum than when we look at the medieval copies. So this idea that they're kind of sharing things.
Yeah, there's some interesting arguments that we're actually getting back to the Middle Ages with digitalization and kind of ideas of presence. But I'm not entirely convinced myself. But I think it is worth probing and pushing at a little. Yeah.
Like how are they both creating an experience, even though they're very different?
Yeah.
But we think of them as being experiential.
Yeah. But the aims of the experience are so different. The one is just so quintessentially personal and selfish, and the other is less so. It's like, I don't know. Playing Assassin's Creed is really like nobody else is there. Well, I'm still doing the old-fashioned one where I'm the single shooter, but. Yeah, well, but it's a community understanding of that, which is not shared with a video game. Yeah. Well, thank you for all these wonderful questions, and thank you for coming out tonight after your spring break, and good luck in the NCAAs.
With Duke, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you. We can certainly continue the conversation outside and where we have a reception. Thank you.